What up, YouTube? Let's here. Thanks again for visiting the channel. As always, I appreciate it. So what do I have for you today? Some of you guys, I think, just by looking at the knives, could probably figure it out. Some maybe not. So today we're going to be going over different lock types on folding knives. I don't have all the lock types that there are, obviously, here on the table. There's way too many for that, and I can't afford to buy uh, all the knives in the world, but I wish I could. There's a few things we got to go over first before we do this video. I'm not gonna go over each scenario with each lock type, but I kind of feel like, for the most part, most people, would be okay with just about any knife that would be released from any reputable or responsible knife manufacturer with whatever lock type they have on their knives. Uh, you know, for the most part, the liner locks, back locks, steel frame locks, titanium frame locks, stuff like that, they're going to do what you need them to do. Like I've said before, always make sure that you're using the appropriate knife for the task that you're performing. General EDC tasks, they're going to be just fine with a liner lock. If you're going to be going out into the woods, chopping down small trees, batoning, stuff like that, you're obviously going to need something a little more substantial. Now, for those of you that don't know, when I say batoning, I'm not referring to like a talent show type of thing. Batoning is kind of when you take a knife and a small log or something like that, and chop it in half. The general process, you take your knife here. You've got a log sitting here, and you can take your knife and put it right at the top of the log, and then you use another heavy stick or log or something like that, and you use it to pound onto the top of the spine of the blade to push it through the log and chop it in half. That basically, in a nutshell, is what batoning is. Also, there's a lot of people out there, survivalists and different things like that. In order to test the strength of a lock for a folding knife, they'll do something called a spine whack test. Now, I on this channel, I'm never going to criticize someone else or say that what they're doing is wrong or stupid or whatever, but there are obviously things that I will disagree with. I don't necessarily feel like the spine whack test is anything that's necessary for anyone to use. First of all, if it can be dangerous, and second of all, if you're ending up in a situation where you're going to be having that kind of acute pressure on the spine of your blade, you should either be using a fixed blade or maybe an axe or something like that, something that's more appropriate to the task at hand. But everybody, if you go and buy a knife, you're allowed to do whatever the heck you want with it. That's not for me to say, but it's a lot of people, when considering the strength of a lock, they'll do things like that, and I just don't agree with that. I don't think it's necessary. But I don't know everything. I'm still a couple of years away from that. So anyway, I've got 11 knives here. One of them on the end here is just kind of something that it's almost like a novelty. I'll just go over it now. This is not something that is very popular. It's called a recoil lock. It's from CJRB. There's two different knives that they have this on. The Krag and the CGRB Kicker. They're both really cool, really good knives. Both of them have liner lock options. But I ended up buying both of them just because this is kind of an interesting lock for me. It's almost like an axis lock or an able lock. It works off of omega springs. And then you've got this little plate here that you pull back in order to disengage the lock. So as I said, it's just like an axis lock, but it's not enclosed inside the knife, except for this bottom part here. There's a track that goes into here. So basically, when you open the knife, it slides back and allows for the knife to move. And then once it gets to where it's going, gets to the stop pin, you can see it moving back there. And then once it gets to the stop pin, it slides forward and it engages the lock and stops the blade from folding back into the knife, obviously. So when you want to disengage this, all you have to do is just pull it back, and then the blade will fall back into the handle. It is a safe lock. It's once you get used to it, it's relatively easy to use, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of practice to get used to it, to hold it the right way. It does allow you to keep your fingers out of the path of the blade when you're closing it, but it's a little bit cumbersome, which is kind of why I don't think it really took off. As I said, there's only 2 knives in existence that have this particular lock on it, which is not necessarily why I'm making it one of the principal knives in this video. But I still think it's interesting enough to show out there, because you can still buy this if you guys want, to go to whatever sites have it and purchase this knife or the kicker. You can do that. So like I said, it's a neat knife, but you've also got the option of buying it in a liner lock as well. So I'll just put that to the side. So I'm starting with the absolute most common lock type, which is the liner lock. This is the Ontario Rat 1, one of the most common budget knives in the community right now. It's a very reliable knife, very easy to use. It's a very flicky knife. I love the way it sounds when you pop that guy open. It's one of my favorite knives. And this is a beater. I mean, this is a $40 or $50 knife. You can do whatever you want with this. And it's very strong. It'll do most anything that anybody needs to do. But obviously, like I said, I wouldn't use this to go splitting wood in half or anything like that, smacking it on the spine of the blade with another log. I don't know that it would hold up to that. But so anyway, the standard classic liner lock is just a piece of steel. It's got 2 steel liners, which is why they call it the liner lock. When you open this, the blade will obviously come out, and once it gets to the locking edge, this liner will just pop out, and it will create pressure pushing the knife up and against that stop pin, which will stop it from moving altogether. It is a very strong lock. As I said, sufficient to do just about what anybody could possibly need, anywhere from cutting a string off your jacket to cutting through packages, slicing up cardboard, stuff like that, and even more aggressive stuff. It's a good lock, and basically all that anybody could really ever need, unless you're taking this out for like a survival situation or something like that you're going to be using in the woods to chop off small branches or twigs or whatever. And it's also, I think, the most popular locking mechanism out there right now. So most knives, I would say, for the most part, especially in the budget territory, are going to have just your standard liner lock. The next one here is pretty much the same thing, but this one is a titanium titanium liner lock. Which maybe is a little bit stronger. As you can see, this one's slightly thicker than the lock on this guy. This one is called the Coke Tools KTC3. It's a smaller knife, definitely a very unique blade shape, blade profile, blade geometry, whatever you want to call it. It's a compound grind, and it's kind of weird. The thinner edge is up towards the top here, and the thicker edge is towards the back, which you don't really see too often. But this kind of knife, obviously, you're not going to use for like super serious hard use. So the titanium liner lock for this guy is more than anybody could ever need. But a titanium liner lock is a really good option. A lot of times, if you have a titanium frame lock, having your finger or something on that frame lock can cause pressure on the blade, which would give you some issues opening and closing it. But when it's covered with the scale, you don't have to worry about that. So I think that's a really good option. A lot of higher end knife makers are starting to make a lot of their knives with titanium titanium liner locks, and especially ones that are nested. So basically all you can see is this part right here. It makes it pretty easy with this this portion of the scale on the other side cut down a little bit. Makes it a lot easier to close it. But as I said, I think that this is a very good option for just about anybody out there who's going to be using this for what it appears to be designed for, is just lighter cutting tasks and things like that. So as next one here is a much heavier use knife. This is the Cold Steel SR1 Light in the Tanto version. There's also a drop point version of this guy. But this is a standard cold steel knife, which is utilizing the triad lock, which is very famous and widely considered to be the strongest lock out there that you can use, which I would agree with. It's a very strong lock. You've got this bar here that goes almost all the way halfway back to the end of the blade. I'm sorry, the end of the handle. And there is a tension bar in here. I don't know if you can see that or not, but there's a small tension bar in here that is kind of bent this way, so that when you push down this bar, it causes resistance, which either keeps the lock down on the back of the blade to keep it open, and then once you push that down, it will release the blade and allow you to close it. There's a stop pin right here, which is obviously a very large stop pin, so that also helps to keep this guy super duper strong. This particular lock, I think, is maximum overkill. I don't think there will ever be a situation that anybody will ever be in that would require this kind of a lock. It's nice to have, however. I mean, it makes for a really strong lock, and it makes the knife safer. But like I said, I don't think that there's ever a situation that anybody would ever be in that they would need a lock like this. If you're using something that would meet or exceed the strength of this lock, as everyone always says, it's been said a million times in the knife community, if you need something stronger than that, you should be using a fixed blade for whatever it is that you're doing. And I mean, this kind of approaches the strength of a fixed blade. I mean, if you're going to be putting this knife into a situation where something's going to break, it's going to be either part of the blade or part of the pivot or the handle or something. Any other part of this knife is going to fail before the lock will. I mean, you can hear this thing when it locks up. I mean, that huge clack sound. I mean, you can just hear how solid that thing is locking up there. So kind of give you an idea of how this is working here. You've got this large opening or cutout or whatever you want to call it. You can kind of see here that the blade is shouldered a little bit to meet up with that stop pin. And as you open it, this bar rises up, making room for the blade to move. You don't have to push down on this to open it or anything like that. So there is kind of like a tooth, maybe that's what I call it, but there's a small piece of metal that kind of hangs down off the tip of this. And as you open the blade itself, the shoulder gets to the stop pin, and that tooth kind of falls down into the blade, locking it. So you've got downward pressure going this way, being held in place by the torsion bar that's in here, pulling the shoulder up against this stop pin. So that's 2 points of contact that make it very, very solid. The thumb studs here are true thumb studs. They don't meet up with the frame of the knife, so those don't add any additional stability or strength. But there are knives, I'll show you in a few minutes here, that these thumb studs here aren't necessarily thumb studs. They're there to stabilize the blade and stop any movement if you're moving the blade side to side or anything like that. But like I said, this one, the triad lock, is widely considered one of the strongest locks in the community, and I think for good reason. This is an awesome lock. I just don't think that there's any situations that you should be using a knife in which would cause this lock to potentially fail. All right, moving on. The Buck 110, which I said before, is one of the most iconic knives out there in existence, and it's that way for a reason. It's an awesome knife. It's a safe knife. It's very strong, very sharp, very well made. It's put together with rivets instead of screws, so you can't take it apart. But there are other knives like that, which don't really seem to bother people. So this has a back lock, which kind of is essentially the same as the triad lock, but it's just a little bit different. So this has a bar right in the center here. You can see this silver pivot, which is raised up a little bit and a different color than these other rivets. So that's how you can kind of tell where your center point or your pivot point is for this particular lock. It is connected to also, there's another torsion bar in here which keeps this plate pushed up, which keeps the knife locked in place and doesn't allow it to close. These are very, very tight. You have to have a lot of strength in your thumbs and your hand in order to close this knife, especially safely. If somebody, when you guys own a Buck 110 and maybe give it to maybe a kid or your wife or something, and they're having a lot of trouble getting this to close, you should probably help them out, because if they put a lot of force on this and they're like moving it this way and that way, there's a pretty good chance they're going to cut themselves. So like I said, these can be very difficult to close if you don't have much strength in your hand. So anyway, as I said, works just about the same as the triad lock. You've got a tooth or a piece of metal that kind of hangs down here, which has a groove cut into the end of the blade. Once you get it to the point where it's going to lock up, that tooth will fall down into that little groove on the blade, forcing it down on this side, and will not allow it to be released. Once you've used the knife, you're done using it, there really is no way to do this one-handed. I'll have to go back to this in a second. There's no way to do this one-handed, but you have to just push down on this bar right here with your thumb, which will raise up this whole piece of metal here, and that will allow you to fold the blade back into place. That is one of the few issues that I see with the triad lock, is it's very difficult to manipulate this one-handed. It can be done. You just have to get used to it, use it slowly and use it gently until you're used to using this. The way you have to close this is have your finger right up against this finger guard here, and then you can push down on the very end of this part of the lock, and that will allow the blade to fall down into place. So you have to be very, very careful. If you don't have your finger close enough to this finger guard here, when the blade falls, it's going to cut your finger. And these are very, very sharp, so you have to be very careful doing that. So once you have it fallen like that, you can just turn it, push it down closed. So it's, you can close this one-handed, but you have to do some practice with it before you can get used to it and not risk slicing your finger open. But once you get used to it, as you can see, it's relatively easy to open and close one-handed. I think that's one of the reasons that this particular kind of lock is not more popular than it is. It's obviously very, very popular with cold steel fans, but it's not on it's not on as many knives as I think it would be if it were a lot easier to use one-handed. So next, I've got the Chavez knives 229. This is the full-size version, and this has a titanium frame lock, which a lot of times has a steel lock bar insert, which prevents wear and tear on the lock bar itself, which would loosen up the lock. But we can get into that in a minute. So essentially, this guy, when you open the blade, it works a lot like a liner lock, but you've got the titanium frame, which when the blade opens all the way, it springs over and engages with that the lock face. So this locks up pretty early. I'd say this is about maybe 10%, which is a pretty early lockup. But I've checked this a bunch of times. This is locked up enough to where it's not going to fail. When you're checking these, I tend to hold mine like this, and I'll move it back and forth, trying to be very careful not to put excess pressure on that bar there, just to make sure that I'm checking the actual strength of the lock instead of pushing it over and making the lock up even stronger. So you want to be careful with that. But obviously, when you open it very, very slowly, you're not going to get as much lockup as you will have if you really push it open. So that's going to lock up a little bit further. So obviously, make that a little bit more safe. So anyway, as this moves over to the lock face, it will lock up the knife. The reason that they use this steel lock bar insert is because titanium is a little bit softer than steel, a little bit more flexible, and over time, years, we're not talking months or anything, that could push this portion of the steel lock bar, the titanium lock bar, back just enough to where it would make it a little bit more loose, which could give you some up and down play, possibly some side to side play, and make your knife a little bit less safe. So they just put a piece of steel in there just to keep that from happening. Now, this was what I was talking about as far as the thumb studs being true thumb studs. On the next knife here, I'll be able to show you that those aren't necessarily just thumb studs. Those are also lugs that will meet up with the handle of the knife, which will provide more stability and strength for the lock. So anyway, titanium lock bar, very, very common, very, very popular locking mechanisms that's used on a lot of knives these days, especially the higher end ones. They do make some steel frame lock knives. I've never been a big fan, and it's not really, I guess there's a few other content creators that have mentioned that there's one or two manufacturers that are coming out with steel lock bar excuse me, steel frame lock knives, and kind of acting like that's a new thing or something special, which is not. They've made those for a long time. It's just they haven't been doing it for quite a while because it's a little bit cheaper to do it that way. So that is, like I said, they're both the same kind of locking mechanism. It's just different materials that are used. What else can I tell you about titanium frame locks? Like I said before, if you put too much pressure on here, that can affect the opening or closing of the knife. It can rub up against the blade, which could cause it to have, I can't fail this knife, but it could cause you to fail opening the knife, which that's unsafe as well. All right, I think that's all for this one for now. Move on to the next one, which is my Hinder XM18 3.5 inch Spanto with the Battle Blue titanium side, and we've got Blue Black G10 on the show side. This is an awesome knife. It's my favorite knife in my collection, coolest knife in my collection. This is just a fantastic knife. I'm sure you guys have heard, everybody in the knife community talk about this thing like it's the holy grail, but I don't know if I go that far, but it's a pretty sweet knife. Anyway, this has the same thing. Titanium frame lock knife. Still has the steel lock bar insert, and we also have a stabilizing disc here, which stabilizes the bar so it doesn't over travel or allow you to push the knife any further in than it should be. But these thumb studs here obviously can be used as thumb studs, but these are actually lugs which meet up with the frame of the knife. These are actually touching here and here, which create a couple more points of contact to make the lock a little bit more stable. This is one of the most common hard use knives in the community today, and people use these things for just about anything. And if you're doing a lot of cutting, hard cutting, moving the blade side to side, these lugs here give you a lot more support and a lot more strength on that lock. It'll cause a lot less stress on the pivot, and it'll cause a little bit less stress on the lock itself. I think that I do not prefer titanium frame locks as much as I prefer possibly titanium liner locks, but I only have one titanium liner lock as of right now. And the reason for that is, you know, like I said, if you're not careful where you're putting your fingers on these guys, this can cause some friction on the blade, which would obviously affect how it functions. So the next one in line here, we have the ProTech Malibu, very popular knife, very difficult to get a hold of, at least initially. I think they're a little bit easier to get a hold of now, but they're still, you have to keep an eye out and you have to wait for the drops. They sell relatively quickly when they do drop. But this knife was, I think initially, the reason it was so popular was because ProTech doesn't make a lot of manual knives, and that causes some issues with people, you know, legal issues in the state that they live in. Some people can't carry automatic knives or side opening automatics or even assisted knives. So this is another option for people to be able to buy. It's a manual knife, so it's, you know, there's no restrictions on that other than the length of the blade, which I believe this is a 3-inch blade. Double check here. That's a little further. It's like a 3.25-inch blade, which might be too long for some people, but for most people, under 3.5 inches, you're pretty safe. So this guy is running on a button lock or a plunge lock, which is becoming much more popular nowadays than they used to be. A lot of knife manufacturers, the last 2 or 3 knives that they've released have been button locks, and that has a lot to do, I think, with the fidget factor. These are a lot of fun to play with, open and close, just pass the time. And it also just makes it easier to use in general. It keeps your finger out of the path of the blade. You don't have to worry about cutting yourself. And it's a very easy way to make the lock work. I'm not sure exactly how to, I'm kind of stumbling over my words here. I apologize. I was just in the hospital for a while. I just got released today, so I'm kind of groggy. Okay, so on this pivot here, I'm not sure if you can really see, but there's a small groove right here on the edge of the under the blade, which when you open it, so this button lock here is keeping the blade closed. It's kind of like a detent, but it's not. So anyway, when you open this, as the blade opens, there's a stop pin, there's shouldering for that. But once it reaches the point that it locks, you can see that button pop up. Now there's a cylinder in here, probably too dark for you to see, but this cylinder, as it pops up, it contacts with the blade. So that's going to stop that from opening or closing. And then all you have to do is just push the button and it allows the blade to fall. There's a few advantages here. You don't have to have a detent because the button lock acts as the detent. And it makes the blade free fall much easier. So as I said, it makes it a lot easier for you to have a lot more fidget factor with your knife. You don't have to worry about the pivot being too tight or too loose. You can screw that in there so that there's no blade play at all, but it still falls shut like it's loose. You almost might think that it's too loose and go to tighten the pivot and realize that it's tight enough to be, good. Button locks are probably my second favorite lock. I prefer the compression lock, but that's just me. Everybody has their own favorites. But as I said, button locks are becoming very, very, very popular these days. Just about everybody, I think, has been making their knives with button locks recently. So moving on to the next one here, we've got the Spyderco Shaman. Sorry. So this one is running on a compression lock, which is another very popular lock, which is actually Spyderco holds a patent for this. So no other knife companies are allowed to use this in making their knives. So it's essentially the same thing as a liner lock. It's just kind of flipped upside down. But there is a difference because, excuse me, when this is open all the way, you've got the stop pin here, which is creating pressure this way. And then once the liner lock itself, the compression lock itself opens up, it slides over and it creates downward pressure onto the another flat part of the blade. So you've got 2 points of contact there, but they're in opposing directions, making the lockup very, very solid. There's nothing here to stabilize it or prevent it from going side to side. But again, that falls under, making sure that the knife you're using is appropriate for the task that you're performing. A lot of people, the reason that I brought the Shaman instead of the PM2 or another knife is because this knife causes a lot of issues with certain people. This compression lock being here, there is a nub or nubbin or whatever you want to call it, which kind of acts as a small finger guard on the blade. And the way it's the way it's assembled and the way the blade is shaped, this little piece of metal here kind of rides up, and it will hit people's fingers if they're not able to move their finger out of the way quickly enough, or just aren't used to using the lock. It'll hit their finger, which honestly is not a problem. There are people that say that it's a flaw in the making of the knife and that it could be dangerous, which that's nonsense. If you were able to just use the knife, a few times, 5 or 6 times, and you realize that thing's going to hit your finger, you can hold your finger a little bit further back on the actual lock. When it's falling, you can move your finger out of the way and get your finger out of the way before that thing hits you. Even if it does hit you, it's not going to hurt anything. It's I always love listening to these videos, these people talking about how that's a flaw in how the knife was made and how it's dangerous and could be a problem. That makes me chuckle because I think that's ridiculous. I do think that the compression lock is probably one of the best locks. It's very strong.